You think embarrassing breakups are bad? Imagine being dragged into a medieval courtroom, naked, and forced to prove your bedroom skills in front of priests, judges, and your in-laws. In the Middle Ages, if your spouse said you couldn't perform, you didn't just lose love. You lost your dignity, your rights, sometimes your freedom. Real court records show men being examined, aroused, and judged like livestock. One man failed 3 times, on the record. And the worst part? These were legal proceedings, not punishment, procedure. By the end of this video, you'll never look at irreconcilable differences the same way. Let's plunge into the twisted truth. If you think medieval justice was just stocks and beheadings, think again. In 1370, John Sanderson stood trembling in a cold York courthouse, not for theft, not for murder, but because his wife claimed he couldn't do his husbandly duty. His punishment? A full physical examination of his genitals in front of clerics, judges, and yes, her relatives. This wasn't rare. In medieval Europe, if your spouse claimed you were incapable, the court summoned experts, midwives, physicians, even monks, who would manually inspect you. They checked for signs of arousal, function, and sometimes even forced stimulation. If you failed, your marriage could be annulled. You could lose your home, your land, even your identity. Court documents from Florence, Paris, and London describe fitness trials as routine. The accused would be stripped, examined, and judged by standards written in medical and religious texts. One man in 1292, Walter Dionte, endured 3 separate evaluations, each more invasive than the last. He failed them all. And the pressure, unbearable. Some men poisoned themselves with dangerous herbs in desperate attempts to perform. One Parisian man even died from a concoction meant to restore vigor. Today, we'd call this medical abuse. Back then, it was proof. But if you thought this was the worst place to prove your performance, just wait until you hear what happened after the trial. Imagine trying to prove your sexual abilities, not in a doctor's office, but in a stone courtroom, with a scribe taking notes as your body was judged like a defective ox. Welcome to the medieval examination chamber, a real place. These weren't secret rooms tucked away. They were purpose-built spaces in city courthouses across Europe, Florence, London, Cologne, featuring raised platforms, wooden benches for observers, and high windows so light could fall directly on the accused. Some even had hooks in the walls for positioning. Certified inspectors were summoned, midwives, physicians, sometimes even clergy. They wore official badges. Their job? Stimulate and observe. Responsiveness, size, duration, even physical symmetry. All documented. In one 1450 Parisian case, Pierre de Franville succeeded only on his 3rd trial, after ingesting herbs that nearly killed him. But success wasn't always salvation. For many, passing still led to humiliation. Fail, and your marriage was annulled. Pass, and you were forced to perform again with your spouse under supervision, in what was charmingly called reconciliation intercourse. Witnesses included the in-laws, the parish priest, and if noble blood was involved. Courtiers and ambassadors might be in the front row. Think this couldn't get worse? In some regions, if the man passed, but the woman didn't, she'd be accused of witchcraft. But this was just the prelude. Because in royal marriages, humiliation was tradition, and the wedding night was a performance. Now imagine this. It's your wedding night. You're 15, you barely know your spouse, and there are 23 people in the room, nobles, clergy, your parents, even the archbishop, all there to confirm one thing, that you've consummated your marriage. In 1445, Margaret of Anjou married King Henry VI of England. Their first night as husband and wife was attended by a live audience. These witnesses didn't wait outside. They stood inside the bedchamber watching the curtains, listening for sounds, even examining the bedsheets afterward. This was called ceremonial verification, and for medieval royals, it was standard. No proof of consummation. The marriage didn't count. Political alliances could crumble, treaties would collapse, wars could begin, and it didn't stop with royalty. In noble households across Europe, the bedding ceremony was ritualized. Guests helped undress the bride and groom, sometimes with singing and bawdy jokes. They paraded the couple to bed, poured them spiced wine, and recited fertility prayers while the couple tried to ignore the stares. Sometimes, curtains were deliberately thin to ensure visibility. One chronicler wrote that nobles rejoiced in the sounds of union. That's a historical quote. And the next morning, the sheets were hung from castle windows or carried through town like battle flags. Still think your awkward honeymoon was bad? Next up, the inspection didn't stop at the sheets. The bride's body was next. The next morning, the evidence wasn't just talked about. It was examined in excruciating detail. Enter the midwives, summoned to inspect the bride's body for signs of consummation. These weren't symbolic gestures. They conducted full physical examinations, checking for tearing, bruising, and internal trauma. Then, they gave sworn statements under oath, recorded in legal documents, testifying whether or not the marriage had been truly sealed. This wasn't about protecting the bride. It was about protecting dynasties. Her body wasn't hers. It was a political certificate. If she didn't bleed, questions arose. Was she really a virgin? Was the union valid? In 1501, when Catherine of Aragon married Prince Arthur of England, 6 nobles were ordered to witness the consummation. The Spanish ambassador stood beside the bed. Later, Catherine insisted the marriage was never consummated, a claim that would explode into a political crisis decades later during Henry VIII's annulment. And in France, Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were expected to perform in front of attendants, and repeatedly failed. It took 7 years to finally complete the act. In royal courts, failure to perform meant annulment, national shame, and sometimes war. That pressure? Inhuman. But if brides were publicly inspected, what happened to grooms who couldn't perform? Simple. They got one more chance, in front of a live courtroom. If a man failed to consummate his marriage, he didn't just face whispers. He faced a judge, a scribe, and a panel of court-appointed examiners with one terrifying command: prove your potency, right now. These were called impotence trials, real, documented events in medieval and early modern Europe where men were ordered to perform in court, sometimes with their wives, sometimes with medical assistants. One French nobleman in 1650 was stripped, prodded, and ultimately told to stimulate himself while scribes watched. The verdict? Incapable. His marriage annulled. His lands? Forfeit. His legacy? Destroyed. In Italy, courts even allowed proxy consummation. If a man couldn't perform, the bride's family could petition for a substitute to complete the act, just to fulfill the legal requirement. You were not just judged for who you were. You were judged for what your body could do, in public. Failure wasn't private shame. It meant the collapse of entire family alliances. Dowries returned, titles revoked, lawsuits, exile, one wrong move in bed, and you were ruined. Some men turned to terrifying aphrodisiacs, wolf blood, crushed emeralds, or mercury paste. One case in 1456 ended with the groom convulsing in court, foaming at the mouth, and dying minutes later. But guess what? His family still lost the case, and while men risked death trying to perform, the women? Many had no way out, even if their husbands were monsters. Now, imagine being a young bride trapped in a marriage with a man who could perform, just not with compassion, not with consent. And you had no right to refuse. In medieval law, once a woman was married, she became her husband's property, and property didn't say no. Canon law even had a name for this: the marital debt. If a husband demanded sex, the wife was legally obligated to submit, regardless of fear, injury, or revulsion. And here's the twist: if a woman claimed her husband couldn't satisfy her, she had to prove it, often by enduring public reconciliation attempts in front of officials. One 14th-century French case recorded a woman being locked in a chamber with her husband for 2 nights, while midwives waited outside. On the 3rd day, she emerged bleeding. The verdict? Sufficient performance. Case closed. In some regions, if the woman tried to leave, her own family could sue her for violating the alliance. She'd lose her dowry, her inheritance, even her name. Divorce? Essentially impossible. The church only allowed annulment if he couldn't perform, not if he was cruel, abusive, or a sadist. One chronicle tells of a bride in Cologne who attempted suicide rather than return to her marital bed. The bishop ruled she was possessed by melancholy. She was exorcised and sent back. But the real horror? For many women, even a wedding wasn't necessary, because the church could test your body without your consent. You didn't have to be married to have your body invaded in medieval Europe. All it took was suspicion, especially if you were a young woman and someone claimed you weren't pure. Enter the virginity exam. If a noble father claimed his daughter was untouched and her fiancé disagreed, the church could authorize an official test. Midwives, sometimes nuns, were brought in to examine the girl's body. No consent, no privacy, just a brutal inspection, often in a cold stone chamber, with male clergy waiting outside for the verdict. Records from 15th-century Venice describe a girl of 12 subjected to this after her betrothal fell apart. The verdict? Her hymen was unclear. Her family's reputation shattered. Her marriage canceled. Her dowry lost. It didn't stop there. Inquisition courts also used virginity tests to identify supposed witches. The logic? If a woman had engaged in carnal acts with the devil, she could not be a virgin. Some victims were just children. If the examiners declared her damaged, that was proof of demonic corruption, and off to the stake she went. One girl in Toulouse was just 9. Her test was overseen by a panel of monks and medical men. Their report claimed unusual warmth. She was convicted and burned. Let that sink in. In a world where virginity was currency, your body didn't belong to you. It belonged to the state, the church, and the rumor mill. And speaking of rumors, next, we dive into the courtroom lies that destroyed lives forever. In medieval Europe, if someone wanted to ruin you, they didn't need poison or daggers. They just needed to whisper, "He can't perform." It happened constantly. A failed business deal, a spurned lover, a jealous rival. Any of them could launch a legal campaign to destroy your marriage and your reputation by accusing you of sexual dysfunction. And the courts? They welcomed it. Case in point. In 1379, a London merchant named Thomas Norbury lost a business dispute with another nobleman. Weeks later, that rival convinced Norbury's wife to accuse him of impotence. Suddenly, Thomas found himself naked in a courthouse chamber, being evaluated by two physicians and a certified notary. His marriage? Annulled. His wealth? Forfeited. His rival? Married the ex-wife days later. These trials were weaponized. In Florence, there are records of elite families using sexual accusations to sabotage alliances. A young man's failure on the examination platform could collapse dowries and dissolve pacts built over generations. The courts didn't care about truth, they cared about procedure. A man's trembling hands were interpreted as lack of vigor. A woman's refusal to endure another public attempt? Evidence of fraud. The irony? The church claimed to uphold sacred marriage, but it actively enabled its destruction through a legal system designed to humiliate, shame, and erase. And in the most grotesque twist of all, sometimes these trials were held not to annul a marriage, but to force one. Think a humiliating trial could only end in divorce? Think again. Sometimes it ended in marriage, by force. In medieval Europe, if a man defiled a woman, whether by seduction, assault, or simply being alone with her too long, he could be dragged into court and ordered to marry her. But the proof wasn't always what you'd expect. In one case from 1462 in Rouen, a woman claimed she had lost her virginity to a traveling musician. The court, eager to protect her family's honor, summoned both parties. The solution? A forced examination of both of them. Midwives inspected her for signs of use, while the man was tested for arousal and culpability. Yes, his arousal was used as evidence of guilt. When he failed to perform in court, he was declared guilty and forced to marry her on the spot. Let that sink in. Your body could convict you, and then tie you for life to someone you didn't choose. In some regions, if a man did perform successfully in court, but refused to marry the woman, he was imprisoned. One Italian record from 1520 details a man jailed for 7 years for refusing to wed a woman he had deflowered as a teenager. She, by then, had already married someone else. Didn't matter. The state demanded punishment for broken honor. So whether you failed or succeeded, the verdict was the same. Your body wasn't yours. It was the court's. But even this madness paled in comparison to what came next, when entire towns got involved in your sex life. In today's world, your sex life is, hopefully, private. In medieval Europe, it could be broadcast like a public execution, because if the courts didn't ruin you, your neighbors would. Adultery, impotence, refusing your spouse, these weren't just private matters. They were community events. Entire towns gathered to humiliate couples whose intimate failures were put on trial. In 1354 Paris, a woman accused her husband of impotence after 5 years of marriage. The judge ordered a full reconciliation attempt, which failed. The punishment? The man was forced to walk naked through the streets, holding a sign that read, "Unfit husband." Townsfolk threw vegetables, chanted insults, and children beat drums behind him. And this wasn't rare. In Florence, men accused of failing in bed were sometimes forced to wear mock phalluses strapped over their clothes, paraded on donkeys while being pelted with rotten food. Women accused of infidelity might be shaved bald and marched barefoot through town squares. Even worse, if the accusations were false, the punishment often still happened, just reversed. This wasn't justice. It was humiliation theater. A form of intimate execution without blood. And the more public the shame, the more satisfied the authorities were. Reputation was everything. And the church believed that humiliation had spiritual value. One chronicler wrote, "Better a man mocked in the streets than rotting in hell." But the real rot? It was in the system itself. And next, we uncover how the church used all of this to control bodies, marriages, and souls. Behind the robes, the incense, and the stained glass, the medieval church was quietly orchestrating one of the most invasive control systems in human history. Not just over souls, but over bodies, over bedrooms, over performance. You think confession was about forgiveness? For many, it was the first step toward surveillance. Priests were trained to ask detailed questions about your intimate life. Did your husband satisfy you? Did you resist him? Did you fake your enjoyment? One 13th century confessional manual advised clergy to press wives on whether their husbands used proper motions and if they fulfilled the debt in full. If not, the church could get involved. Canon law declared that failure to perform was grounds for annulment, but only if the right people agreed, which meant the church held the keys to marriage, divorce, even legitimacy of heirs. No performance, no heir. No heir, no noble line. No noble line, chaos. In return, the church gained power, land, and money. Petitions for annulments required hefty fees. Fitness trials were taxed. Virginity inspections required licensed midwives, who kicked back earnings to the bishop's office. Even witnesses to consummation were sometimes paid clergy. The very institution preaching chastity profited from forced sex, public exposure, and humiliation. It wasn't about purity. It was about control. And to prove just how far that control went, let's look at what happened when even dead bodies weren't safe from the church's obsession with performance. You might think death would release you from medieval sexual scrutiny, but in some cases the church reached beyond the grave. Just to make a final point. In 1306, a French nobleman named Sir Geoffrey de Vaucelles died suddenly, shortly after marrying a young bride. The problem? No consummation. And since she hadn't inherited his lands yet, the bride's family panicked. So what did they do? They petitioned the church to examine the corpse. Records show that 2 monks and a physician were dispatched to verify the state of the deceased's body. What were they looking for? Evidence of capacity. One report claims they examined the genitalia for size, firmness, and signs of recent activity. When they couldn't find any, the bishop nullified the marriage retroactively. The bride lost her dowry. The man's property reverted to the crown. Dead or alive, your body belonged to the law. In another case, a woman's corpse was dug up to prove she'd never consummated her marriage, so her husband could remarry without sin. Her pelvic bones were examined for signs of use. The priest in charge declared her intact. Her husband remarried that same week. What does that tell you? Even in death, the medieval body had no dignity. It could be inspected, prodded, and judged, all to satisfy legal, political, or spiritual demands. But if you think these horrors died with the Middle Ages, you're wrong. Some of these ideas are still baked into our laws today. Think this madness vanished with plague masks and pointed shoes? Think again. The ghost of medieval sex trials is still haunting us. Today, in dozens of countries, laws still exist that determine whether a marriage is valid based on consummation. In the United Kingdom, until 2023, a marriage could be annulled solely because a couple hadn't had sex. No abuse, no coercion, just failure to perform. It was the same logic as 1350, just wrapped in cleaner language. In parts of the Middle East, Southeast Asia, and even Europe, virginity certificates are still demanded of brides. Girls are taken to doctors, their bodies judged. Families pay to prove purity. Some are shamed, disowned, or worse, because of a false test based on ancient medical myths. And let's talk about courtroom humiliation. In modern divorce proceedings, lawyers still bring up sexual performance. In custody battles, in immigration hearings, there are documented cases of women being denied asylum because they couldn't prove same-sex attraction through detailed sexual histories. Sound familiar? The stage, the judgment, the consequences, they haven't disappeared. They've just gone digital, transformed into policy, procedure, and bureaucracy. The audience isn't the town square anymore. It's the courtroom, the government, the internet. So the next time someone says, "We've come so far," remember this. There was a time when you had to perform your worth, in public, under oath, and we're not nearly as far from it as we like to think. Let's step back for a second. We began with the image of a trembling man in a courtroom, stripped naked, being judged for whether he could perform. We've seen brides inspected like livestock, husbands forced to prove their masculinity in front of clergy, bodies examined after death, and communities cheering as men were mocked with fake phalluses and women paraded bald through cobblestone streets. What we've really seen is a system that turned intimacy into evidence, desire into duty, and shame into spectacle. From England to Italy, from Paris to Florence, these weren't fringe incidents. They were law, enforced by popes, bishops, kings, and scribes who truly believed that sex was not private but public property. If you bled, you were a virgin. If you didn't, you were a fraud. If you performed, you were a man. If you couldn't, you were less than human. And yet, none of it was medically accurate. Hymens don't prove virginity. Arousal can't be summoned on command. Psychological trauma can paralyze even the healthiest body. But none of that mattered. Because truth was never the point. Control was. You see, these trials weren't about love or justice. They were weapons. Tools to decide property, inheritance, reputation, and power. If you were a woman, your purity determined your value. If you were a man, your potency determined your worth. And both could be challenged in court, based on nothing but rumor. Sound familiar? Because even today, echoes of this madness remain. Virginity myths persist in sex education. Religious groups still preach purity culture, shaming young people, especially girls, for behavior that was never anyone's business to begin with. Politicians debate access to reproductive rights based on imagined moral fitness. Marital rape wasn't illegal in all U.S. states until 1993, and across the world, thousands of women still undergo forced virginity tests every year. We may not march men naked through town squares anymore, but the impulse to police bodies and the obsession with performance hasn't gone anywhere. We just hide it behind cleaner language, behind laws, behind tradition. But the rot is the same. And perhaps the darkest irony of all? The very institutions that claimed to uphold morality, the church, the courts, the monarchy, enabled these horrors. They built systems that demanded obedience, then used humiliation to enforce it, all while preaching purity, faith, and family values. It's easy to look back and feel smug, to say, that was the dark ages, we're better now. But are we? Ask the girl denied entry to school because of a fake virginity test. Ask the man whose sexuality is put on trial in a courtroom. Ask the survivor of marital abuse who's told to reconcile because of faith. Ask anyone whose worth has been reduced to what they do or don't do in bed. This isn't just history. It's a mirror. So maybe the real lesson isn't how strange the past was. Maybe the real horror is how familiar it still feels. Which part shocked you the most? Was it the courtroom performances, the post-mortem exams, the church's role, Let us know in the comments. And if you're grateful that your sex life isn't a public trial anymore, hit that like button. Subscribe for more brutally honest deep dives into history's darkest corners. And share this with someone who still thinks the good old days were really that good. Because history isn't just about kings and wars. Sometimes it's about a man standing naked in a courtroom while the world laughs. And that's a story worth remembering.